Hey guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to give you some of the notes for the topic of the Mongols. This is specifically the rest of the notes, that you have in the packet primarily are about the case study of the Mongols in China. It's just one example of the Mongols conquesting and then the Mongols also ruling. And one of the debate topics is related to this case study. So it's useful to kind of go through in class. And as you prepare for the debate, we can also note some of the other areas that the Mongols go. We know that they're into Europe, even into areas, Hungary. They head into Poland. They head into Korea. There's a variety of different places, kind of east and west, that the Mongols, over the course of 3 generations, end up. And so any one of those could be a topic that you might address if you have the first resolution for the debate. In any case, if we look at specifically the Mongols under Chinggis Khan, remember that it's 1206 that he becomes, through the meeting of the Kurultai, this very large-scale, meeting of tribal leaders where he gets appointed as the leader of the Mongols. And as this specific kind of leader, he's got a more unified group. People are going to be loyal to him. He's able to break down some of those tribal infightings that had really defined the society. And, he is able to unify groups. And a lot of historians would argue that these 3 different societies that are to the right on the map, the Tangut people, the Jurchen people who are living in the Jin dynasty, and then the Han Chinese who are living in the southern Song dynasty after 1127, after it splits from the northern Song when the Jurchens invade. These various parts of what we would kind of say is, maybe comprising of China, these different political systems are all involved in trade relationships with the Mongols. So the Mongols kind of in their pastoral lifestyle are depending on some of the goods that are coming from these societies, right? In some of these cases, it's going to be a variety of textiles. It might be some foodstuffs. There's a variety of things that the Mongols kind of come to trade. And the Tangut people is one of the groups that are going to start to end some of their trade deals. And there is some efforts for the Mongols to invade the Tangut. So that's one of the groups that's targeted first. So even before the date of 1211, we see the Mongols, engaged with activity. And then if you kind of look at where the Jin dynasty is, and let's see if I can move my cursor over here. This would be like kind of modern day Beijing. In this particular area, there's a great city development, and the Mongols start to make headway into the territory run by the Jin, and they are interested in kind of cutting a deal, and there is a relationship that's reestablished. Kind of a deal is made that certain goods are going to be delivered to the Mongols, and ultimately the local leader in the Jin dynasty doesn't make good on some of those promises, and they pay the price. This area, including kind of this very large-scale city in the northern part of the Jin dynasty, is completely taken down. There's a month-long siege. The Mongols will, wait outside the city and ultimately capture it, and it becomes like an example of a really, really horrific in some way because a great number of people are killed. There's a great amount of destruction. So as a conquest, it's kind of noteworthy. Largely, this is the one conquest where a lot of historians say it's related to trade deals gone bad. The other part of this is it enables the Mongols to see a great amount of the development of what's happening in the Jin dynasty and ultimately in the southern Song. And we don't see there really being a letting up. The Mongols will continue to make incursions into China over the course of a few generations. So we know that Chinggis Khan, in some of his efforts, will conquer a good part by the time we get to 1215. A lot of the area here is already conquered. After Chinggis Khan dies, so in between the time he is conquering China, a big part of the Jin dynasty, this northern part here, he's also making inroads to go all the way to Central Asia and is in a conquest of Khorasan, an area that includes a Turkish rule and a great number of Persians living under Turkish rule. And this particular society is also targeted less because of trade, likely more because of revenge. But Chinggis Khan is involved in these two large-scale conquests, ultimately in an effort to make his way back to China. He targets the Tangut people again, and in moving into China for a second time, Chinggis Khan dies. Then his son Ogadai, who rules for like 20 years, ultimately conquers the rest of the Jin dynasty, and Chinggis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, will be involved in taking on the southern Song and creating what becomes the Yuan dynasty, the putting together of both the Jin dynasty and the southern Song portions, and the Mongols as a foreign dynasty, will lead the entire dynasty, and that's in 1279. It's huge. This is a massive, massive space, and Kublai Khan will become not only the military leader who's involved in capturing the southern Song, he also will become the first emperor of the Yuan dynasty. Okay, those are just the resolutions. A couple of just reminders about the southern Song at the time that the Mongols make their headway, and they do take on a great deal of the cities that are already established, and they kind of move directly in. The southern Song dynasty has a great deal of success, especially in an economic sense. We saw this with the Chinmin Scroll. We saw this with some of the things that you read about in the benchmark, this incredible commercialization. There's a great deal of economic production, so different regions are specializing in things like porcelain or in particular metals. There's a variety of different things that are being produced, and we also have a really hefty urban culture. A lot of that is driven by innovations that are made in the agricultural sector. Investments in infrastructure, from the Sui and the Tang, start to pay off in the Song dynasty, and you end up with this really large-scale commercial urban society in quite a few of the major cities, like Hangzhou, for example, and we see a great deal of wealth that gets created, and lots of people within the Song dynasty are participating in this wealth. So peasants, for example, whose lives are difficult and challenging, might find that they are enabled to seek better wealth through connections into this commercial, kind of network. There's a great deal of innovations that are spurning a whole bunch of new economic activity, and a lot of this is domestic, kind of going from the south, to different regions, around the dynasty. There's also a great deal of global trade, and so you have kind of a very diverse society, especially in some of the coastal areas. There's large numbers of people from around the world who are coming to be part of the activity in the Song dynasty. So you're getting kind of these variety of foreign ideas. Some of that is some things that are changing up the society, and culturally, kind of like on the eve of Mongol attacks, we see a very sophisticated financial system, very sophisticated, economic activity, a great deal of urbanization, agriculture is kind of really on the uptick. There is a strong imperial system and a great deal of increasing diversity. So kind of have that in mind. At the same time, we know the scholarly class is kind of your really significant class, and the military is weak. One of the major weaknesses of the Southern Song is not having that strong military for defense, and that plays out with the Mongols. The other thing is just this culture that's embedded with scholarship. So everything from the size of the bureaucracy grows in the Song dynasty. So the physical size of the government, is growing. It's being fed by many more people taking the civil exams and passing the civil exams, even though the passing rate, especially for the imperial level of the exam, is still so very low. There's a good number of people who are participating in taking the civil exams, and the efforts related to the civil exams expand during this time. there is this really significant status for the scholarly class. And, note that your government bureaucrats are largely, Confucian scholars, and Confucian scholars that are also being influenced by the ideas of Taoism and Buddhism. And there's some degree of syncretism between these belief systems, that people are being influenced by these varieties of belief systems. At the same time, there are some groups that do push back against foreign ideas, Buddhism, Taoism. Sometimes groups are not necessarily getting along. There are ways in which each of these belief systems kind of tied together, and also ways in which sometimes they can be opposed. But at the same time, and the benchmark reading gave you some sense of that. So while you might have, Buddhist monks, for example, kind of adhere to a life that's very much as an aesthetic, like a life, that's apart from others, somebody who might be committed to, being within a monastery focused on the ideas of a religion, whereas Confucianism may be very focused on the family model. Buddhist monasteries not set up in that same idea. So the ways in which they're practicing some of the traditions are completely different. Confucianism is something where there's an emphasis on kind of the human world, the relationships, the social aspects, the rituals that are forming those relationships, this kind of reciprocal ways in which, maybe father and son are connecting to each other, and some of the rituals that are putting in place principles and values such as filial piety. Confucianism is kind of about establishing order, but doing it through a way of creating institutions based on relationships, based on certain principles, where people are bringing certain ethics and morals into those relationships. And there's kind of a common collective understanding. Some of the ideas of Taoism, for example, are a little bit different than that, where the idea is very much to not intervene, that nature and natural patterns to the world in some cases are existent, and we have to maybe in sometimes, not try to change it all the time, but try to adapt or see our own roles in this larger, framework. And the key aspect of the time in terms of some of the changes, and it doesn't really get coined during the time, and it may not be as obvious during his lifetime, but the name here, Zhu Xi, is instrumental because it's at this time where we would say there is like this intellectual kind of breakthrough, maybe a change up in the way Confucianism becomes practiced, where it develops almost like this pathway of sorts, that there is going to be a very personal kind of self-cultivation aspect to Confucianism, where individuals start to see an effect of having a way of changing the world comes through, changing and cultivating yourself through the role of gentleman. And so the scholar in the Song dynasty becomes distinct because they're not only maybe following Confucian texts, but Zhu Xi will actually change up some of the texts that get followed. So like the Analects, these stories about the sayings of Confucius are still used. So there's still some like classical texts that are involved in Neo-Confucianism, but there's also like new ideas also embedded into the key and core texts. And Zhu Xi is also commenting on some of these texts. And so his commentary becomes crucial to the civil exam at the time. So it's like a change up in the way Confucians and Confucian scholars are going to dedicate themselves as gentlemen to a great deal of self-cultivation, and that self-cultivation then enables greater cultivation of the family, greater cultivation of the state, greater cultivation, of the world. There's kind of this longer path, and it does relate to this idea that Zhu Xi connects to some things in Taoism and also in Buddhism. So, one way of looking at some of these influences are, in particular, influences on Confucianism. And, we see a lot of this get established in art of the Song Dynasty. We see this established in the texts that are read and in the Confucian civil exams. I'm going to hit the stop button here and then just do a little bit with the Mongols into the Song Dynasty and just setting up some of the big differences once the Mongols come to power. Okie doke. I will make the next